The waning years of the Eastern Han dynasty were not unlike the final embers of a dying fire, still burning, still dangerous, but slowly being swallowed by the darkness of chaos. China, a vast empire once unified under imperial law and Confucian ideals, was now a fractured land of ambition and betrayal. Amid the grand clashes of warlords and the thunder of rebellion, it would be easy, almost inevitable, for the stories of the silent and steadfast to be swept away like ash in the wind. Yet one such story remained, that of a woman whose name few would remember, but whose strength quietly shaped the fate of a dynasty. She was known only as Lady Gan. Born into modest obscurity during a time when women were rarely recorded by historians unless they were queens or troublemakers, Lady Gan's early life is a mystery. She did not hail from a powerful family, nor did she carry a name that would strike fear or reverence. But in the fabric of history, her thread, though thin, ran deep. It is often in the quietest hands that the most enduring legacies are sown, and Lady Gan would prove to be one such weaver, stitching together a fragile life beside a man destined for both glory and grief. Liu Bei, the man she would come to call husband, was himself a paradox. A descendant of the Han royal line, he had the blood of emperors but none of their privileges. Orphaned young, he grew up selling straw mats and shoes alongside his mother. From these humble roots, he developed a character shaped less by entitlement and more by endurance. And it was during this restless rise, through failed appointments, short-lived alliances, and desperate gambles that Lady Gan entered his life. There is no surviving record of how they met. No romantic legend, no poem, no inscription carved into temple stone. But what is known, or at least can be reasonably inferred, is that Lady Gan became part of Liu Bei's household during one of his many early attempts to establish a foothold in the world of politics and war. She was not his only wife, nor perhaps even his first. Yet among them all, she would be the one whose bond with him endured the longest, surviving exile, betrayal, and battle. At a time when loyalty was currency and trust could be fatal, Lady Gan stood by Liu Bei not because he was powerful, but precisely because he was not. She knew hunger just as he did. She knew fear, not of armies or swords, but of silence. The silence of waiting for a man to return from war, the silence of a palace with no heir, the silence of her own name as history marched forward without it. What she brought into Liu Bei's life was not political capital or military strategy, but something far rarer in that age: emotional ballast. When Liu Bei's ventures failed, as they often did in the early years, it was Lady Gan who held the domestic realm together. While he fled cities and rebuilt forces, she packed what little they had and moved without protest. Her strength was not the kind that commanded armies, but the kind that endured them. She bore the weight of uncertainty so he could chase the impossible. In many ways, her presence gave Liu Bei a kind of legitimacy that went beyond bloodlines. He was not just a wandering warlord. He was a husband, a father, a man rooted in a family. In an era when the family unit was the moral foundation of society, Lady Gan's fidelity and quiet dignity served as a subtle signal to Liu Bei's followers. Here was a man worth trusting. He did not discard his wife in search of political advantage. He did not forget those who knew him when he was poor. He held fast to her, and in so doing anchored himself. When Liu Bei took over Shuzhou, briefly enjoying the fruits of command, Lady Gan was there, not as a queen, but as a quiet observer of his trials. And when he lost the city, forced to flee once more under threat from rivals like Lu Bu and Cao Cao, she was again at his side. Each time he fell and rose, she followed. Their lives became a cycle of retreat and regroup, defeat and determination. Through it all, she asked for nothing, made no demands, left no writings. But her presence alone became a form of resilience. It was during one of these uncertain periods that Lady Gan gave birth to Liu Shan, the child who would one day inherit the throne of Shu Han. For Liu Bei, whose legitimacy as a potential ruler depended not only on conquest but on continuity, the birth of a male heir was a turning point. It solidified his claim not just to power, but to a legacy. And it was Lady Gan who made that possible. Motherhood, in the age of the Three Kingdoms, was both a personal and political act. A mother of an heir was not merely a caretaker but a symbol of dynastic stability. And yet, Lady Gan was never one to wield that status for personal gain. She remained in the background, raising her son not with the trappings of nobility, but with the quiet fortitude that had defined her life. She prepared Liu Shan not for the throne, but for survival, a lesson far more valuable in a world where kingdoms rose and fell within a season. The path ahead for Liu Bei would become more violent, more ambitious. He would face betrayals by those he once called brothers, witness the fall of his sworn companions, and eventually rise to declare himself emperor. But none of those milestones would have been possible without the steadying influence of Lady Gan during his most vulnerable years. Her contribution was not made on the battlefield, but in the spaces between them. When Liu Bei was not fighting, he was regrouping. When he was not fleeing, he was building. And in all those moments of transition, those quiet, uncertain intervals, it was Lady Gan who kept his world from unraveling. There is a temptation in history to measure significance by visibility. Men like Cao Cao or Sun Quan dominate the records because they commanded legions and reshaped borders. But Lady Gan's power lay in what was never written, never spoken, never celebrated. She was the calm between storms, the hearth kept lit during war. She was the voice that never needed to be raised, because her loyalty was louder than any proclamation. As the Han dynasty crumbled and the Three Kingdoms emerged from its ashes, Lady Gan remained largely invisible to the chroniclers. But to Liu Bei, she was not just a wife. She was the reason he remained human amid the inhuman demands of empire building. In an age where ambition consumed loyalty and thrones were built on betrayal, she offered something revolutionary: constancy. Her story, then, is not one of drama or grandeur. It is a story of endurance, of being present when it mattered most, of offering stability in an age of ruin. And though she would not live to see her husband crowned, or her son take the reins of a kingdom, her legacy was already embedded in the soul of Shu Han. For every law Liu Bei wrote, every soldier he commanded, every battle he fought, there was a memory of a woman who once walked beside him, not as a shadow, but as a foundation. Lady Gan's life did not end with a sword or a scandal. It ended with silence, a silence that history mistook for absence. But beneath that silence was a lifetime of love, loyalty, and quiet influence. And in the echo of that silence, the kingdom of Shu would rise. The early years of Liu Bei's political and military ambitions were marked not by triumph, but by instability, exile, and the near-constant taste of defeat. His journey toward founding the Shu Han state was not one paved with swift victories or loyal allies. Rather, it was one of relentless perseverance through cycles of fragile hope and brutal disappointment. And within this long, winding road, the presence of Lady Gan stood as a rare source of constancy. As his world shifted, as cities fell and alliances crumbled, she remained the one figure who never wavered. Her loyalty was not performative. It was survival. It was quiet devotion made visible only in hindsight, an invisible architecture of support that made Liu Bei's rise possible. By the time Liu Bei briefly held command over Su province, his reputation was that of a virtuous man often undone by the treachery of others or the misfortunes of fate. His moral integrity, while admired, was seldom enough to secure lasting power. Liu Bu, whom Liu Bei once sheltered, turned against him with characteristically volatile ambition. Forced to flee from the very lands he once governed, Liu Bei embarked on a period of wandering that would define much of his early career. These were not the wanderings of a man in search of glory, but of a man desperately trying to keep his cause and his life intact. Lady Gan, by then the mother of his only son, traveled alongside him through these uncertain years. While generals and advisors might come and go, fall in battle or defect to other lords, she stayed. It is difficult to imagine the physical and psychological strain of that lifestyle. To be uprooted constantly, to raise a child in the shadows of siege engines and abandoned camps, To sleep in borrowed quarters knowing they might be taken at any moment. It required a fortitude that history rarely attributes to women. But Lady Gan possessed it in abundance. In her endurance, Liu Bei found not only companionship but a kind of unspoken encouragement. Her continued presence validated the struggle, gave it personal meaning beyond political ambition. When Liu Bei took refuge with Cao Cao, one of the most powerful and cunning warlords of the age, he was forced into a paradoxical position. On one hand, he accepted Cao Cao's hospitality and title as governor of a region. On the other, he harbored the internal rebellion of a man who could never accept subordination. In this delicate dance between cooperation and resistance, Lady Gan served a subtle but crucial role. While her voice may not have been heard in war councils, her influence was felt in the shape of Liu Bei's resolve. She reminded him of who he was, not just a general or a strategist, but a husband and father carrying the weight of something more enduring than temporary victory. Eventually, Liu Bei broke away from Cao Cao, setting into motion a series of battles and retreats that would test every fragment of his strength and patience. One of the most defining moments of this period was the Battle of Changban, where Liu Bei, fleeing Cao Cao's massive army, chose to prioritize the safety of civilians rather than abandon them to speed up his retreat. It was a decision that cost him valuable time and nearly his life, but it also immortalized his image as a ruler who valued people over power. Lady Gan was there. While historical records focus on generals and units and strategic losses, they neglect to note what it must have been like for her. Escaping with a child in her arms, surrounded by chaos, watching her husband risk everything not just for survival, but for a moral stand. That choice to protect rather than abandon reflected a deeper value system, one nurtured, perhaps, as much by the quiet strength of a devoted wife as by ancient texts of Confucian virtue. During this flight, the family was nearly separated. In some accounts, Liu Shan, their son, was almost captured or lost. Lady Gan, despite the dangers, managed to stay with him. The desperation and terror of that moment are easy to gloss over in history books but impossible to ignore when viewed through the eyes of a mother. Her priority was not politics or titles. It was protecting the child who represented both legacy and love. After narrowly escaping, Liu Bei eventually formed an alliance with Sun Quan of the Wu Kingdom, an uneasy partnership cemented by marriage to Sun Quan's sister, Lady Sunday. This alliance, while politically expedient, introduced complexity into Lady Gan's world. Though she was Liu Bei's longtime partner and the mother of his heir, she now found herself sharing space with a younger, more politically connected woman. Yet even in this shifted dynamic, Lady Gan did not compete for influence or status. She remained centered, focused on her son, and on preserving the values that had guided her family thus far. Lady Sun, by contrast, was a fierce and independent woman, raised in a martial family, unafraid to assert herself within Liu Bei's household. Her presence brought tension to the domestic sphere, especially as political alliances shifted and suspicions grew. In time, Lady Sun returned to Wu, attempting to take Liu Shan with her, an act foiled by Zhao Yun and others loyal to Liu Bei. Once again, it was Lady Gan who stood at the heart of the crisis, the mother who had to trust that the child she bore would not be taken from her as spoils of political intrigue. In this tumultuous period, Liu Bei began to coalesce a vision for a legitimate state, one grounded in the ideals of Han restoration and moral leadership. His partnership with Zhuge Liang, the brilliant strategist and statesman, elevated his efforts from reactive survival to structured governance. But even as the Shu Han state began to take form in the western territories of China, the memory of the years spent fleeing, losing, regrouping years during which Lady Gan had never left his side, remained etched into the very bones of his leadership. Liu Bei's inner circle, including famed figures like Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, represented loyalty in arms. But Lady Gan embodied loyalty in absence of power. Her presence didn't shape military campaigns, but it shaped the man who led them. She gave him a reason to endure when every calculation said he should quit. She offered stability in a world defined by shifting allegiances and betrayal. As Liu Bei took Chengdu and began to lay the foundations for his empire, Lady Gan's health began to fail. The years of hardship, the constant relocations, the strain of raising a child in war, all had taken their toll. She did not live to see her husband crowned Emperor of Shu. Yet, in her final years, Lady Gan died with little fanfare, as she had lived. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no statues erected in her honor at the time. But Liu Bei, deeply affected by her passing, would later posthumously name her Empress, a title she had never sought but one she had always embodied. It was a rare moment in which history allowed her voice to echo, however briefly, in the corridors of power. In many ways, Lady Gan represented the soul of Shu Han long before it had borders. She represented the values Liu Bei claimed to protect: righteousness, family, loyalty, and endurance. While others fought for ambition or revenge, she remained a living example of perseverance without recognition. In her life, she was the invisible axis around which a kingdom slowly turned. In her death, she became a symbol of what that kingdom claimed to stand for. For Liu Bei, her absence was more than personal grief. It was the loss of an emotional compass. As he moved toward the final, more aggressive phases of his rule, the stabilizing force that had tempered his judgments was gone. Her memory would linger, but her quiet counsel, her silent assurances, could no longer reach him. Yet her legacy persisted in the man she had helped mold, in the son she had raised, and in the ideals that continued to animate the cause of Shu Han. In a time when power was measured by steel and blood, Lady Gan's influence endured without sword or title. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of power, one that does not demand but defines. As the embers of the Eastern Han continued to die out, the land plunged deeper into a chaos that devoured even the most careful plans and the strongest alliances. It was in this volatile world that Liu Bei sought to carve out his claim, not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of virtue, a descendant of the imperial line returning justice to the realm. But even virtue needs allies, and even righteousness can be shaped by circumstance. When survival depends on compromise, even the most principled must bend. And in bending, new fractures form, especially in the places most intimate. It was during one of the most pivotal decisions of Liu Bei's rise to power that the balance Lady Gan had so carefully preserved was thrown into quiet turmoil. The alliance with Sun Quan, ruler of the southern kingdom of Wu, was not born of trust, but of necessity. The threat of Cao Cao loomed large over the fractured Chinese landscape, and if Liu Bei hoped to resist the expanding northern war machine, he needed more than moral high ground. He needed a partner with ships, men, and territory. It was a union forged on the edge of desperation, sealed with the oldest political currency of its kind: marriage. Lady Sun, the younger sister of Sun Quan, was offered as bride to Liu Bei. The gesture was strategic, a test of loyalty, and a warning wrapped in silk. She was not simply a gift. She was leverage, a living treaty with eyes and ears of her own. For Liu Bei, accepting this marriage was a concession to diplomacy. For Lady Gan, it was a silent shift in the world she had helped build for decades. Lady Sun arrived not as a passive consort, but as a force. Raised in a household of warriors, she was bold, commanding, and unafraid of conflict. Her presence within Liu Bei's household was not one of meek subservience but of assertive identity. She brought with her a retinue of guards and a temperament unaccustomed to quiet compromise. Where Lady Gan had spent years stitching a household from the fabric of humility and endurance, Lady Sun threatened to unravel it in weeks with noise, pride, and ambition. Yet Lady Gan did not resist. She did not challenge or scheme. Her answer was the same as it had always been: steadfast silence. It was not the silence of resignation, but of clarity. She knew her place not in terms of rank, but of meaning. Titles can be assigned, but legitimacy is earned. And hers was written into the very survival of Liu Bei's legacy, the upbringing of his heir, and the moral architecture of his vision for governance. In the corridors of Liu Bei's growing court, tensions simmered between the two women. Lady Sun commanded attention, but it was Lady Gan who retained trust. Servants knew where true influence lay. Advisors recognized the emotional weight she carried for Liu Bei. And the people, when they whispered of the emperor's family, remembered the woman who had fled with him during the darkest years, carrying his child, standing beside him not as decoration, but as endurance made flesh. Lady Gan did not have the ear of generals or the favor of strategists. She did not appear in public ceremonies or issue edicts, but in the private hours of dusk, when the noise of the court faded, she was the one Liu Bei returned to, not always in person but in thought. Her presence was a compass, even if distant. She had become the fixed point from which all his navigation was measured. But power makes no allowance for sentiment, and the political landscape around Liu Bei was changing rapidly. The alliance with Wu, solidified through marriage, gave Liu Bei access to valuable territory, most notably Jing province. It was a region of immense strategic importance, and controlling it gave him the leverage to begin building the structure of a sovereign state. Yet it also placed him in direct competition with the very people he had just allied with. The trust between Liu Bei and Sun Quan, tenuous at best, began to erode. And at the center of that eroding alliance was Lady Sun, torn between loyalty to her birth family and the ambitions of her husband. As political maneuverings grew more dangerous, Lady Sun became increasingly volatile. In one of the most dramatic moments of this fraught alliance, she attempted to return to Wu, taking the young Liu Shan with her. Whether this act was one of maternal desperation, political manipulation, or familial loyalty remains debated, but for Lady Gan, it was something more personal and more devastating. A direct threat to everything she had built, everything she had protected. It was the first time the legacy of her son was placed in true jeopardy. Not from warlords or armies, but from within his own household. And yet, Lady Gan had no army of her own, no power to call upon. She had only faith, and the loyalty she had inspired in those who had known her quiet strength for years. It was Zhao Yun, one of Liu Bei's most devoted generals, who intercepted the attempt and returned the boy safely. But behind his courage was the memory of the woman who had carried Liu Shan through the flames of Changban, who had nurtured him when the world offered no sanctuary. Zhao Yun was not rescuing a child. He was rescuing a legacy, and honoring the woman who had made that legacy possible. The incident marked the end of Lady Sun's time in Shu. She returned to Wu, her departure as politically symbolic as her arrival. And when she left, the house once again returned to its original gravity. Lady Gan resumed her quiet stewardship, not just of her son, but of Liu Bei's domestic world. Her influence did not increase with titles or favor. It returned like breath to a chest that had been holding too long. In the aftermath of the alliance's collapse, Liu Bei faced the consequences of trust misplaced. Relations with Sun Quan soured, and the ambitions that once united them now placed them on a path to confrontation. But even as diplomacy failed, and the drums of war began to echo once again through the river valleys and mountain passes of southern China, Lady Gan remained where she always had: near, steady, calm. She understood, perhaps better than most, the cost of such ambitions. She had watched Liu Bei lose too much, too often, to believe in clean victories. And yet she did not oppose him. She knew his mind, knew that his fight was not only against enemies, but against time, against fate, against the erosion of purpose in a world where purpose was constantly compromised. Her strength was not in resistance, but in acceptance. She allowed Liu Bei to pursue the destiny he believed in, even if it meant she would remain a footnote. In doing so, she became something greater than consort or mother. She became a symbol of what that destiny meant at its core. It was not about conquest or glory. It was about something far older, far more sacred, the preservation of honor in a world bent on consuming it. And so she endured, through alliances made and broken, through households reshaped and restored, through the constant motion of armies and arguments, she endured. Her thread remained, woven not into flags or armor, but into the private corners of a kingdom struggling to be born. In an age where kingdoms were shaped not only by swords but by bloodlines, the birth of a son carried consequences that rippled far beyond the walls of the home. For Liu Bei, whose dreams of restoring the Han legacy depended on more than righteous proclamations, the birth of Liu Shan offered a thread of permanence in a world dominated by impermanence. But for Lady Gan, the child's arrival brought not just joy, it brought the weight of history, responsibility, and fear. It was the beginning of a quiet metamorphosis. As she shifted from the role of wife to something far more delicate and politically perilous, the mother of a future emperor. Liu Shan was born into uncertainty. There was no throne waiting for him, no palace to receive his first cries. The world he entered was one of constant movement, shifting allegiances, and the ever-present shadow of defeat. Liu Bei, though noble in name and earnest in spirit, was still a man on the margins, a commander with no kingdom, a claimant with no crown. And yet, with Liu Shan's birth, a sense of legitimacy began to take root. For the first time, Liu Bei could envision not just a cause, but a continuation. Lady Gan understood this instinctively. Her life, up to that point, had been marked by endurance, following Liu Bei through exile, sleeping in the corners of borrowed cities, raising her head each morning to an uncertain horizon. But now, she had something more than a man to protect. She had a legacy to preserve, and she knew, better than anyone, how fragile legacies could be. From the beginning, her approach to motherhood was shaped not by luxury or tradition, but by resilience. She did not raise Liu Shan as a prince. There were no courtiers, no rituals, no silk canopies to shelter his infancy. He was born into the arms of a mother who had learned to live without comfort, and she taught him the same. She held him close during flights from enemy forces, wrapped him in wool during winters spent hiding in unfamiliar provinces, and whispered ancient lullabies not to put him to sleep, but to remind herself that hope still existed. As Liu Bei's fortunes shifted, especially following his alliance with Sun Quan and the brief acquisition of territory, Liu Shan became more than a child. He became a political symbol. He was the bridge between Liu Bei's bloodline and his ambition, a living proof that the House of Liu could rise again. And as that symbol grew in importance, so too did the risks surrounding him. Every rival knew that capturing or killing the boy would deal a blow to Liu Bei's claim. And every ally knew that the child's survival was key to stability. Lady Gan, never trained in politics, found herself at the center of this delicate equation. Her every move mattered. Whom she trusted, whom she allowed near her son, even the expressions she wore at court, all carried implications. She had to become, quietly and without instruction, both mother and guardian, protector and teacher, and she did so with the same silent strength that had carried her through war. But even the strongest walls crack under pressure. For Lady Gan, those cracks came in the form of doubt, not in her child, but in the world that awaited him. She saw the men around Liu Bei, the generals hardened by battle, the advisors sharpened by years of political maneuvering. She saw how quickly loyalty could turn into rebellion, how easily alliances shifted like river tides. And she knew, in the deepest parts of her being, that her son would one day inherit not peace, but a kingdom shaped by wounds. She watched as Liu Bei became increasingly entangled in power struggles. His moral clarity, once the defining trait that set him apart from warlords like Cao Cao, began to blur under the weight of responsibility. He made compromises she once believed he would never consider. He allowed ambition to seep into decisions that used to be grounded in virtue. And while Lady Gan never voiced her concerns publicly, she felt the change as only someone who had known him since the beginning could. The man she had once followed barefoot through the ruins of cities was now building one of his own. But at what cost? As Liu Shan grew, Lady Gan kept him close. She taught him to read, not just the classics of Confucius, but the expressions of those around him. She trained him not in war, but in awareness. She taught him when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. These were the tools he would need to survive a future she would not live to see. And though history would later remember Liu Shan as a weak or ineffectual ruler, what it often forgets is that he was raised not to conquer, but to endure. In this, he was his mother's son. The court, meanwhile, began to evolve. As Liu Bei's vision for Shu Han took form, more officials arrived, more rituals were established, more eyes turned toward the family at the center of the rising state. For the first time in her life, Lady Gan had something like a fixed residence. But even within stone walls and candlelit chambers, she remained a figure of quiet restraint. She did not indulge in ceremony. She did not seek influence. She understood that her power lay not in presence, but in constancy. There were moments of tenderness amid the turmoil. Brief evenings when Liu Bei would return from council to sit beside her and their son. Days when the weight of the world momentarily lifted, when laughter echoed through halls not yet corrupted by bureaucracy. In those moments, Lady Gan allowed herself to believe that perhaps the kingdom they had both suffered for might finally offer peace. But such peace was fleeting. The threats never ceased. Even as Liu Bei began to secure territory and surround himself with competent ministers like Zhuge Liang, danger lurked on every border. The tensions with Sun Quan never truly disappeared. The specter of Cao Cao's northern might still loomed. And internally, there were always whispers of disloyalty, of discontent, of people who remembered Liu Bei not as an emperor, but as a refugee. Lady Gan saw all of this, and she prepared her son accordingly. She spoke to him of kindness, but also of vigilance. She told him stories not just of heroes, but of those forgotten by history. She showed him how to recognize sincerity behind flattery and fear behind anger. Her lessons were quiet, but they were built to last. She knew that one day, when she was gone and Liu Bei no longer shielded him, Liu Shan would face a world where love was rare and power was always conditional. Her health began to falter as the weight of years spent in struggle caught up with her. The constant movement, the exposure to harsh climates, the psychological strain, it all took a toll. She never complained. She never allowed weakness to show. But her steps grew slower, her presence thinner. Those who had served the household since the days of wandering noticed it first. Not in words, but in the way she held onto walls a little longer, or the way she watched Liu Shan a little more closely, as if memorizing the contours of a face she knew she would not see forever. She never asked for recognition. She never sought ceremony. But even as her body faded, her influence deepened. Liu Bei, for all his burdens, began to sense the approaching absence. He spent more time near her, not always speaking, but being. Theirs was a bond forged not in palace gardens or orchestrated courtship, but in the mud of refugee camps, the smoke of burning towns, and the quiet resolve of rebuilding again and again. She had been the one constant, the one truth, and as she slipped from the world, that truth became irreplaceable. Lady Gan died before Liu Bei formally declared himself Emperor of Shu. She never wore a crown, never stood beside him on a throne. But when he did finally ascend, one of his first acts was to honor her posthumously as Empress. It was not just a gesture of grief, it was an admission of debt. Everything he had built, every stone of the new state, every law inscribed, every oath sworn, rested on a foundation she had quietly laid. In a world that glorified conquest, Lady Gan's legacy was built on survival. In a time when women were written out of history, she left her imprint not on parchment, but on people. She raised a son not to be a conqueror, but to be a guardian. She shaped a ruler not with doctrine, but with empathy. And she taught a husband, even amid the din of power, how to return to himself. Her life was not measured in battles won or titles gained, but in the strength to remain whole in a world designed to break. And in that, she became something few in her time ever managed to be. A quiet architect of dynasty, a mother to a kingdom, and a symbol of endurance that history could not entirely erase. As the landscape of China fractured into three distinct spheres of power, the ambitions of warlords matured into kingdoms. What had once been alliances of necessity and conflicts of survival transformed into statecraft, diplomacy, and a race toward legitimacy. The three kingdoms, Wei in the north under Cao Cao and his successors, Wu in the southeast under Sun Quan, and the new realm of Shu in the west under Liu Bei emerged from the ashes of a crumbling Han dynasty. It was in this moment of transition, this turning of rebellion into rulership, that Liu Bei finally found what he had been seeking for decades, a throne. But it was a throne built not solely on victories or bloodline. It was constructed on years of loss, struggle, and the sacrifices of those who would never sit beside him on its dais. Chief among them was Lady Gan, who had passed before the dream became tangible. Her absence haunted the palace at Chengdu, the capital of Shu. Though new halls were built and courtiers filled them, though silk banners bearing the emblem of Han restoration hung from balconies, Liu Bei moved through it all with the ghost of another time trailing behind him. The silence of Lady Gan's absence was louder than any fanfare. She had not lived to see the kingdom they had both bled for in different ways. And yet, her influence infused every stone. When Liu Bei accepted the mantle of emperor, he did so with reluctant ceremony. He had long resisted the trappings of kingship, preferring to present himself as a humble servant of the Han legacy. But the world had changed, and with the fall of the Han, there remained no imperial order to defer to. The people needed a symbol, the soldiers needed a cause, and his advisors, especially Zhuge Liang, believed that the time had come for Liu Bei to become what history required. Still, beneath the gilded robes and ritual incense, there was a man who remembered a simpler truth, that a kingdom built for justice must be rooted in more than ambition. It must carry with it the burden of the lives it had consumed along the way. For Liu Bei, Lady Gan had always been that moral anchor. Her steady presence in years past had reminded him of why he fought, not for territory, but for order, not for titles, but for legacy. With her gone, he faced the challenge of holding onto that clarity amid the noise of court politics and the gravity of expectation. To those around him, her name remained a whisper, spoken with reverence by older servants, recalled with warmth by generals who remembered their days of hardship. But to the younger generation, including Liu Shan himself, Lady Gan was already becoming more legend than memory. Her image was preserved in posthumous portraits, her virtues extolled in memorials commissioned after Liu Bei's ascension. Yet none of those inscriptions could capture the texture of her presence, the way she had shaped decisions not through decree, but through quiet restraint. As Shu Han grew into a functioning state, with bureaus and ministers, grain stores and tax records, Liu Bei found himself immersed in the very responsibilities he had once yearned for. But governing required a different skill set than rebellion. Where once he had the clarity of opposition, to Cao Cao's tyranny, to warlord infighting, now he faced the complexities of administration. Justice had to be balanced against practicality. Loyalty had to be weighed against competence. And through it all, he had to present the image of a ruler guided by righteousness. In this environment, Lady Gan's legacy reasserted itself in subtle but powerful ways. The values she had modeled, patience, modesty, steadfastness, became touchstones for Liu Bei's approach to rule. He surrounded himself not with flatterers but with those who had proven their worth through endurance. He continued to foster a culture of ethical governance, even when expediency might have called for harsher measures. And he leaned heavily on the counsel of Zhuge Liang, whose own vision for a just state mirrored the ideals that Lady Gan had so quietly embodied. But the pressures of empire are not easily resisted. As Shu expanded its bureaucracy and cemented its defenses, it also found itself increasingly encircled by rival ambitions. Wei, under the capable leadership of Cao Pai, Cao Cao's son and successor, had declared its own imperial status, claiming legitimacy through the abdication of the last Han emperor. In response, Liu Bei's claim to restoration became more than a matter of principle. It became a challenge to the new order. War, it seemed, was inevitable. Liu Bei, now in his 60s, understood the cost of war more intimately than any general. He had seen what ambition could destroy, how quickly cities could fall, how easily armies could vanish. But he also understood something more personal, that to retreat now, to allow Shu to exist as a passive border state, was to abandon the very ideals that had sustained him through exile and defeat. He had not suffered the loss of Lady Gan, of brothers in arms, of youth and peace, only to bow before an unworthy empire. And so, the machinery of war began again. Armies were mustered, maps were studied, plans were drawn. Liu Bei returned not to the battlefield as a young commander filled with fire, but as an older emperor carrying the weight of every life his decisions would affect. In his eyes, this final campaign was not an expansion, it was a vindication. Even in death, Lady Gan's influence remained present in his choices. He ordered that her spirit tablet be placed near his own in the imperial ancestral temple. He directed that her name be spoken in ceremonies, that her example be shared with court women raising future generations. She was not just the mother of his heir. She was the mother of his nation's conscience. As the drums of war echoed across the hills of Shu, Liu Bei would sometimes retire to the gardens of Chengdu, where flowers bloomed in arrangements she had once admired. It was in these quiet moments that the emperor became again the man she had known, reflective, burdened, yet resolute. The memory of her faith sustained him, even as he prepared to risk everything once more. The kingdom of Shu, for all its promise, was still fragile. It had risen quickly, forged through desperation and held together by idealism. Without Lady Gan's stabilizing presence, Liu Bei struggled to navigate the court's undercurrents. Factions emerged, whispers spread, and even those who had once served with unwavering loyalty began to harbor doubts. The question lingered in every corridor. Was the emperor still guided by righteousness, or had grief and ambition clouded his judgment? Yet Liu Bei pressed forward. The battles to come would determine not only borders, but the legitimacy of his life's work. And as he prepared to cast the dice once again, he carried within him the lessons of a woman who had never worn armor, who had never spoken before crowds, but whose strength had made his own possible. Lady Gan did not live to see the flag of Shu raised above the walls of Chengdu, nor to witness the proclamations of empire or the rituals of court. But in the fabric of that state, in its laws, its culture, its vision of justice, her presence remained. She had been the quiet heart of Liu Bei's household, and now she was the silent soul of his kingdom. In the balance of ambition and virtue, of action and restraint, of fire and stillness, she had always leaned toward the latter. And in doing so, she had anchored a future that would long outlast her name. The palace at Chengdu had become a place of echoes, of triumphs realized too late and voices that no longer filled its chambers. For Liu Bei, the weight of the crown he had long resisted now rested heavy upon him, not only because of the responsibilities it entailed, but because the woman who had endured the journey to that moment was no longer there to witness it. Lady Gan, whose life had been defined by movement and survival, had not lived long enough to sit beside the man she had followed across mountains and through the ashes of fallen cities. Her absence, profound in its silence, marked a turning point not only for Liu Bei, but for the moral compass of the kingdom itself. She had died without ceremony, as she had lived. The news had not spread across the empire with urgency or shock. There were no panic declarations, no dramatic shifts in alliances. Her death was not the death of a politician, but of a woman whose power had never been loud. Yet within Liu Bei's private world, the loss unraveled threads too finely woven for others to see. He had endured the deaths of comrades before, warriors like Guan Yu whose passing would soon ignite vengeance. But this was different. This was not a comrade. This was the foundation. The person who had seen the man beneath the armor, the doubt behind the speeches, and who had never asked him to be more than he was. In the days following her death, Liu Bei retreated inward. Though his advisors urged continued expansion, though his court praised victories and plotted future campaigns, he often found himself seated in the chambers where she had once tended to their son, where her footsteps had quietly measured time through years of exile. It was not the grandeur of her presence he missed. It was the stillness, the gentle certainty that came from being seen without pretense. He realized, perhaps too late, that the crown he now wore had always been softened by her gaze. Without it, the gold weighed like iron. He ordered her posthumous elevation to Empress, a gesture meant to honor not just her role as mother to the heir, but her unseen labor in the creation of the kingdom. Her spirit tablet was placed among the honored dead of the imperial family, and rituals were performed in her name. But these were acts of state. They could not conjure her smile, her soft reprimands, or the silent fortitude she had offered during every retreat and defeat. Ritual soothed the court. It did nothing for the hollow in Liu Bei's chest. Lady Gan's death came at a time when the kingdom stood at a dangerous precipice. The alliance with Wu had collapsed completely following the death of Guan Yu and the loss of Jing province. The betrayal stung not only because it was strategic, but because it struck at the emotional heart of Liu Bei's cause. Guan Yu had been more than a general. He had been a brother in all but blood. His fall was not just a loss of military strength. It was a personal wound that reopened every scar from the long years of struggle. Had Lady Gan still lived, perhaps Liu Bei might have found his restraint. She had always tempered his passion with her quiet presence, a reminder that not all battles were worth the cost. But now, in her absence, grief and fury conspired to drown reason. He began to prepare for war, not just to recover lost territory, but to avenge what he believed to be a spiritual betrayal. The campaign against Sun Quan was not merely strategic. It was personal. It was mourning turned into motion. The halls of Chengdu, once echoing with the soft rhythms of domestic life, now pulsed with military urgency. Commanders were summoned, logistics discussed, maps unfurled, and in the center of it all, Liu Bei stood like a man possessed. Not with madness, but with certainty, the kind that often precedes disaster. He spoke less, listened less. Even Zhuge Liang, whose voice had once carried weight enough to divert storms, found it difficult to reach him. Lady Gan's absence was never more visible than in these moments. Where once she might have sat in quiet counsel, now there was no one to draw his thoughts back from the edge. Her strength had never been to argue against action, but to remind him of its cost. Without her, there was no echo of consequence, no shadow of doubt. There was only the fire of purpose, burning unchecked. The court watched with unease. Some believed vengeance was just, that a kingdom built on loyalty could not survive if its oaths were broken without consequence. Others feared the toll. Another war, more conscripts, another drain on the fragile stability they had only just begun to enjoy. But no one dared speak against the emperor's will. Not when his eyes still carried the grief of a friend slain and the silence of a wife buried. When Liu Bei departed for the campaign that would culminate in the disastrous Battle of Yiling, he did so not only as a sovereign seeking justice but as a widower seeking release. Each step away from Chengdu was a step away from memory, from the rooms that once held laughter, from the garden paths where Lady Gan had once walked with Liu Shan in her arms. War was not simply about territory, it was about distance. From sorrow, from guilt, from the unbearable ache of enduring a world she no longer touched. On the battlefield, he was not the commander of old. He was heavier now, not only in body but in spirit. He drove his army forward with a grim determination, but there was little joy in it. Even the prospect of victory brought no anticipation. He was a man completing a task, fulfilling an obligation to the dead, his brother, his pride, his sense of order. And yet, in the darkest hours of the campaign, when tents sagged under rain and men whispered of omens, his thoughts returned to her, to the way she had looked at him not as a ruler, but as a man, to the way she had wrapped their son in layers on cold mornings, to the quiet resolve in her voice when all else seemed to collapse. The Battle of Yiling became a disaster, not simply because of miscalculation, but because of emotional blindness. The fire attack that destroyed Liu Bei's army was as much a literal event as it was a metaphor for his state of mind. A blaze ignited by unchecked passion, consuming everything in its path. Thousands died. Veterans who had followed him since the earliest campaigns were lost. His dream of righteous retaliation turned to smoke. Broken physically and emotionally, Liu Bei retreated to Beidasheng, a remote citadel along the Yangtze. There, surrounded by the mountains and the river, he began to fade. His health deteriorated rapidly, weakened by illness and the weight of failure. Yet it was in those final days, when the ambitions of empire had crumbled into the solitude of a sickbed, that his thoughts found clarity again. He called for Liu Shan, now a young man, to join him, and though he offered words of advice and entrusted the boy to Zhuge Liang's guidance, there was something else in his gaze, a longing not for succession, but for peace. He looked at his son and saw not an heir, but a child once cradled by hands now turned to dust. He spoke of governance and duty, but his voice carried the residue of a man who knew how fragile such things were. In the quiet hours, attendants claimed he spoke to shadows, that he murmured names lost to the court. They did not understand. He was speaking to her, not in madness but in memory, revisiting the moments they had shared, not the grand ones but the small, the meals taken in silence, the nights under shared blankets when the wind howled outside, the time she had bandaged his hand after a fall, the lullabies she had sung when the world felt like it would never be whole again. Lady Gan did not live to see her husband's final days, but she was present in them nonetheless. Her absence had shaped his last campaign, and her memory shaped his last breath. When he died, the kingdom mourned an emperor. But behind the banners and the rites, behind the solemn expressions of ministers and generals, there remained a deeper grief, one known only to those who had seen him as she had, who understood that the crown was not the culmination of his journey, but the burden he had carried since she left. In the years that followed, Liu Shan would inherit the throne, guided by the brilliance of Zhuge Liang and the systems his father had put in place. But he would also inherit the quiet lessons of his mother, the endurance, the empathy, the awareness that power means little without people. And though history would judge Liu Shan harshly, forgetting the strength it takes to survive what others cannot, the truth of his upbringing remained rooted in the legacy of a woman who had never sought recognition, yet shaped an empire from behind its walls. Lady Gan's death marked the end of a chapter in Shu's history, not because she held office or commanded armies, but because she had embodied the values the state claimed to uphold. With her gone, the balance tilted, ambition took the reins, and sentiment was left behind. Yet her legacy did not vanish. It lingered in gardens, in quiet halls, in the stories told by servants and the gestures repeated by those who remembered. She had been a compass, silent but steady. And when the storms of grief and vengeance finally tore Liu Bei from his course, it was not because she had failed, but because the kingdom had never fully understood how much of its stability had rested on a woman who had asked for nothing in return. By the time Liu Bei donned the imperial robes of Shu, the man beneath them was no longer the youthful idealist who had once vowed to restore the Han with nothing but borrowed armor and steadfast friendship. He was an emperor now, but an emperor forged in loss. The coronation, held in Chengdu, was rich in symbolism. The final act in a decades-long struggle to reclaim legitimacy, to plant the flag of righteousness atop the broken summit of a fractured empire. But behind the banners, behind the chants of loyal ministers, there was something hollow in the ceremony. The throne had been won, yes, but the people who had once made it feel meaningful were gone. Among the most deafening absences was that of Lady Gan. Her death had left a silence in the court that even the most loyal advisors dared not speak of. She had been posthumously honored, enshrined beside the ancestors of the new imperial line. Her name was spoken in ritual, her image preserved in delicate brushwork, her virtues extolled in the records compiled by Liu Bei's scribes. But all of it, for the man who sat beneath the yellow canopy of state, felt like mimicry, a way of pretending that she still anchored his judgment, that her presence lingered beyond incense smoke and marble tablets. In truth, the throne changed him. With her gone, and with Guan Yu lost to betrayal, the compass of Liu Bei's internal world began to spin without direction. What had once been a guiding sense of virtue, rooted in restraint, patience, and mercy, was now slowly eroded by the corrosive tide of grief. He had not simply lost people, he had lost parts of himself. The gentle husband, the reflective brother, the idealistic warrior. All were drowned beneath the armor of an emperor who now saw vengeance not as sin, but as necessity. It was perhaps inevitable. In her lifetime, Lady Gan had been the quiet guardian of moderation, her very existence a check on extremes. Without her, there was no voice reminding Liu Bei that power, no matter how righteous its origins, was still a force that demanded humility. There was no one left to remind him of the days when he had been nothing. A man sleeping beneath thatched roofs, humbled by defeat, held together only by the hands of a woman who never stopped believing in him. Now his court was filled with sycophants. Even Zhuge Liang, his most trusted strategist, found it harder to steer the emperor away from decisions clouded by emotion. The planned campaign against Wu, born of grief over Guan Yu's death and humiliation over the loss of Jing province, became the defining priority of Liu Bei's reign. It was not a campaign of justice, it was a campaign of fury. And though Shu's resources were limited, and its people still weary from the burdens of nation-building, Liu Bei pushed forward with military preparations. One can only speculate what Lady Gan would have said, had she still lived. Perhaps nothing. That had always been her way. But her presence had never relied on words. She would have reminded him with her stillness, with her gaze, with the soft patterns of domestic life that had once centered him. In the place where her voice had once echoed, now only ambition stirred. And ambition, unmoored from memory, is a dangerous companion. The campaign moved forward. Generals were dispatched, logistics drawn. Chengdu, once filled with the energy of new governance, began to empty of troops and spirit. Even the people, who had once celebrated Liu Bei as a virtuous alternative to the chaos of northern warlords, now whispered questions behind closed doors. Was this vengeance or justice? Restoration or destruction? Still, no one could deny that Liu Bei moved with conviction. And that conviction, in part, was fueled by ghosts. He wore the title of emperor, but it clung to him uneasily. He was no tyrant, no usurper, but he no longer saw the world as he once had. Every banquet held in the palace reminded him of who wasn't seated beside him. Every state document, sealed with the imperial sigil, was signed with a hand that no longer trembled but no longer felt. It was as if his heart had calcified, becoming strong, yes, but incapable of warmth. Lady Gan's memory had not vanished. In fact, it loomed larger in death than it had in life. Her name became a moral parable, invoked by ministers to calm debates, by educators to inspire daughters, by poets who had never met her but imagined her as a figure of serene strength. But this growing mythology only deepened the chasm between her and the emperor she had once known. The world remembered her as virtue incarnate, but Liu Bei remembered her as something more human. Someone who had laughed beside him in tents during storms, who had dressed wounds in silence, who had held Liu Shan during nights of flight and fear. And it was Liu Shan, their son, who bore the strangest weight of all. He was now the crown prince, the future of Shu, the link between bloodline and vision. But he was also the living echo of Lady Gan. In his mannerisms, Liu Bei sometimes saw her. In his voice, occasionally her timbre. But Liu Shan was not her. He had been raised in courts, not on the road. He had known books more than hunger, silk more than hardship. And while he was not unkind or incapable, he was sheltered, protected by the very sacrifices his parents had made. Liu Bei loved his son, but there were moments, late at night, when he feared for him. Not because Liu Shan lacked goodness, but because he lacked the trials that forged greatness. Lady Gan had raised him with care, yes, but the world he would inherit was not built for care. It was a world of calculation, of steel, of shadows. And Liu Bei, more than anyone, knew that thrones without guardians were quickly buried under the ambitions of others. That fear, too, pushed him toward war. If he could avenge Guan Yu, if he could reclaim the honor Shu had lost, perhaps he could secure a legacy strong enough for Liu Shan to inherit. Perhaps he could die not as a man broken by sorrow, but as a founder who had finished the work his wife had once whispered he was born to begin. But even victory could not resurrect what had been lost. In the imperial chambers, Lady Gan's portrait hung beside the ancestral tablets. Each morning, incense was lit beneath it. Each dusk, a servant ensured the candles burned evenly. The portrait showed her as she had appeared in the early years, calm, observant, slightly distant. But for Liu Bei, no ink could capture the truth. Her silence had once calmed him more than any advisor's voice. Her resilience had stood taller than any fortress. Now she was an image, a story, a lesson told to concubines who would never meet her. As he prepared to depart Chengdu for his final campaign, Liu Bei paused before her likeness. No one knows what he thought or whether he wept, but the staff noted that he lingered longer than usual, that he did not speak when offered armor, that he refused an escort to the gates, choosing instead to mount his horse in silence. The emperor rode away not toward conquest, but into memory. Her absence would shape everything that followed, not through action, but through the void where her presence once lived. And in that void, vengeance grew. In that void, so too did destiny. The empire that Liu Bei built, the dream he had chased since the days when he walked through burning cities with nothing but faith and ragged robes, came under fire not from the front lines of foreign enemies, but from the fractures within. The alliance with Sun Quan, once a political necessity, forged in marriage and sealed in blood, had crumbled into bitter animosity. The loss of Qin Chao and the death of Guan Yu were not just military defeats. They were spiritual betrayals. For a man who built his kingdom on brotherhood, honor, and righteousness, such betrayals required an answer. And Liu Bei, no longer a man governed by moderation, answered with war. He marched eastward not simply to reclaim land, but to reassert a vision of the world that had already begun to die. The army he assembled was vast, a final show of strength drawn from the veins of a kingdom already stretched thin. Advisors hesitated, ministers whispered, even Zhuge Liang, his most loyal strategist, remained behind, entrusted with Chengdu and Liu Shan. This was not a campaign built on strategy. It was built on emotion, grief disguised as duty, vengeance cloaked as justice. Had Lady Gan been alive, the campaign may never have happened. She had always been the quiet boundary, the gentle break on Liu Bei's impulse to chase ghosts. Her presence offered perspective, grounding him when losses blurred reason. Without her, there was no home to return to in his heart, no voice to whisper restraint. She had died just as his need for her wisdom had become most urgent. Her death had left a vacuum, and grief had filled it with fire. The campaign began with early successes. Shu's armies moved swiftly, taking positions, forcing Wu to retreat. But the terrain was unforgiving. The heat of the summer scorched the river valleys, sickness spread through the ranks, and supply lines grew fragile. More importantly, Wu's commander, Liu Shan, was young, strategic, and patient. He baited Liu Bei's army into a false sense of control, allowing them to overextend, to camp in the woods under a sky that grew darker by the day. Then came the fire. Liu Shan launched a coordinated attack that set ablaze the forests and encampments where Liu Bei's troops had made themselves vulnerable. It was not merely a battle, it was an inferno. Thousands perished in the flames, caught between chaos and confusion. What had begun as a campaign of retribution ended in smoldering devastation. Liu Bei, once heralded for his virtue, now presided over the ashes of his own decisions. The emperor escaped, wounded in spirit more than flesh, retreating to Beidasheng, a fortress along the Yangtze River, nestled among mist-shrouded mountains. There, surrounded by silence and the sobering knowledge of failure, he began to fade. It was not only the war that broke him. It was the realization that everything he had built was as fragile as the friendships he had once sworn would never die. Guan Yu was gone. Zhang Fei, too, had fallen, murdered by his own men. The oath sworn in the peach garden had unraveled, not by time, but by consequence. The three brothers who had defied the world had now become two ghosts and one aging, grieving emperor. And Lady Gan, his wife, his anchor, had long since left him. What remained was memory, and a son too young, too gentle to carry what he could not. At Beidasheng, Liu Bei summoned Liu Shan to his side. He spoke to him as a father, as an emperor, and perhaps as a man confessing the truth of regret. He entrusted the boy to Zhuge Liang, asking him not only to guide the empire, but to protect what his wife had once held most dear. Liu Shan, in those moments, became the thread connecting past to future, not because of strength or cunning, but because he was hers. He was the final remnant of a life that had once meant something more than politics and vengeance. In the quiet of Beidasheng, Liu Bei wandered the gardens and halls, remembering. The campaign against Wu had been his last great act, not of leadership but of despair. He had convinced himself that he was protecting Shu's honor, but in truth, he had been running from sorrow, trying to find in conquest what he had lost in companionship. He had marched toward his own undoing with the conviction of a man haunted by absence. Lady Gan had never spoken in grand declarations. She had never told him to fight or not to fight, but her presence had always been a mirror, reflecting the parts of himself that he could trust. Without that reflection, he had looked outward for validation and found only fire. The people of Shu mourned the failure quietly. The empire did not collapse, but it trembled. Morale dipped, resources strained, and though Liu Bei still breathed for a time, the spirit that had once carried him through countless defeats was dimmed beyond rekindling. He spoke little in his final months, instead requesting offerings for his ancestors and long walks alone. Those closest to him reported that he often sat beside the river, staring across its endless flow, his hands clasped as though praying to someone only he could see. Perhaps he was speaking to her. In the end, Liu Bei died not on the battlefield, not in the blaze of war, but in reflection. He passed away in Beidasheng in 223 AD, leaving behind a throne too heavy for the boy who would ascend it. Liu Shan inherited more than an empire. He inherited the ghosts of dreams too big for one lifetime. But perhaps it was Lady Gan's influence, long buried but not forgotten, that shaped the gentle approach of Liu Shan's early reign. Though history would later judge him as weak, those who knew him understood that he ruled not with conquest, but with compassion. He did not wage wars of expansion. He did not purge his court. He trusted Zhuge Liang, and he honored his mother's memory in ways quiet but enduring. And so, the legacy of Lady Gan lived on, not in battles won or lands conquered, but in restraint, in the survival of Shu beyond its founder's flaws, in the way one woman's quiet strength continued to whisper through the corridors of power, long after the drums of war had faded. The fire at Yiling had burned away more than tents and soldiers. It had consumed the last illusions of invincibility. But in the ashes, what remained was something purer. The truth that even the most righteous fall, that even emperors mourn, and that sometimes, the most powerful influence is the one that never sought to lead. Lady Gan had never worn armor. She had never commanded armies. But she had endured every battle, survived every retreat, and raised a child not to avenge a name, but to remember it. The final days of Liu Bei's life unfolded not with fanfare or ceremony, but in the hush of retreat, among mountains that loomed over the Yangtze River like watchful spirits. Beidasheng, the fortress of white cliffs, was not a palace built for emperors. It was a place of exile and reflection, suited more to monks than monarchs. And in the stillness of its stone halls, the man who had once chased the dream of restoring the Han found himself surrounded not by generals or victories, but by memories. It was there, in the quiet after the firestorm of Yiling, that Liu Bei began to slip beyond the grasp of his empire. His body had weakened, worn down by the relentless years of war, exile, and ambition. But more than his body, it was his spirit that had dimmed. The fire that had once lit his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to resist tyranny, to reclaim honor, to build a kingdom out of dust, now flickered low, choked by the weight of accumulated sorrow. He had lost too much. Guan Yu, Zhang Fei, and most painfully Lady Gan. Her absence was not simply felt. It had become a constant presence in his mind, a hollow echo in every decision, every breath. Each morning, he rose with the help of attendants and moved slowly through the corridors of Beidasheng, wrapped in plain robes. The colors of royalty no longer suited him. They were garments meant for men concerned with appearances, with courts, with perception. Liu Bei had transcended or fallen beyond such things. What he sought now was clarity, and in the absence of power, in the void that remained after ambition had burned itself out, he found himself drawn backward, not to battles, not to proclamations, but to the woman who had walked beside him through it all. He began to speak of her again, not publicly, not to ministers or scribes, but to himself, to the walls, to the silence. Servants passing by his chambers would hear murmurs. Lady Gan's name, the name of their son, fragments of recollection. One day it was the night they first fled a burning city together. Another day it was the memory of her hands wrapping Liu Shan in cloth during a winter too bitter to forget. He would pause beside the incense bowl where her spirit tablet had been placed and remain there, eyes unfocused, lips moving in prayer or conversation. Those around him understood that he was nearing the end. But they also recognized something else: he was not afraid. His death was not a thing he dreaded, but a path he had begun to walk willingly. There was no crown heavy on his head, no scroll in his hand. Only memory, and in that memory, a peace that had long eluded him. The empire he had built carried on. In Chengdu, Zhuge administered with tireless devotion. Liu Shan was being prepared for the mantle of state, and the ministries continued their rhythm. But none of it mattered to the man seated beneath the mountain mist, watching the river move as it always had. Liu Bei had begun to understand that kingdoms rise and fall, thrones are inherited and forgotten, but what lasts, what endures, is something quieter. It was Lady Gan who taught him that. She had never spoken of conquest, never urged him toward power. She had borne no title in life, sought no authority. Her ambitions were woven from different fibers: safety for her family, dignity in hardship, loyalty in silence. She had walked beside him not because of what he might become, but because of who he was. In the end, that truth was more profound than any edict. And so he wrote a letter to Zhuge, not long, not filled with instruction, but weighted with trust. He told him to care for Liu Shan, to guide him not with iron but with patience. He knew his son was gentle, not forged for the brutality of empire. And he knew, too, that the world was changing. But if anyone could bridge that gap, it was Zhuge. The chancellor represented the kind of leadership Lady Gan had once embodied: thoughtful, steady, quiet in strength. In one of his last lucid moments, Liu Bei asked for the chamber to be cleared. Alone, he sat by the open window where the breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of pine and river. He held in his hand a small wooden object, a hairpin once worn by Lady Gan, kept through the years in a lacquered box wrapped in cloth. It was not gold. It was not gemmed. It was a piece of her. Simple, real. A relic of a world that had made him human long before it made him emperor. There were no witnesses to his final breath. No speeches. No last words scripted for history. But those who found him later said that his face was calm, that his hand still held the hairpin, and that the incense near her spirit tablet had burned to its end. News of his death spread quietly through Shu. The court held mourning rituals. Ministers wept. The people, many of whom remembered the days when Liu Bei had walked among them without guards, felt the loss like the setting of a second sun. But beneath the formalities, beneath the drums and robes and rites, the most faithful among them remembered what had truly made their emperor who he was. Not the throne, not the wars, not even the cause, but the woman who had believed in him when he had nothing to offer. Lady Gan had died years before him, but her story did not end there. In the years to come, Liu Shan would continue to honor her memory. Her values, compassion, temperance, loyalty, found quiet echoes in his reign. And even when political winds shifted, when Shu eventually fell to the might of Wei, and her name was spoken less often in court, the people of the inner palace never forgot. The maids who had once served her passed her stories down to the next generation. The scribes who had recorded her posthumous titles remembered her not for ceremony, but for warmth. And Liu Bei's servants, now old themselves, still placed flowers at her shrine. Simple chrysanthemums, the kind she once admired during walks beneath the walls of Chengdu. It is easy for history to forget the quiet ones, the ones who do not command armies, who do not issue decrees. But it is also easy to misunderstand power. True influence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it stands behind, unseen, holding up what might otherwise collapse. Lady Gan was not the voice that commanded the room. She was the silence that made room for others to speak. She was not the strategist who won battles. She was the memory that reminded those who did why they fought at all. Liu Bei died an emperor. But more than that, he died a husband who had spent the last years of his life searching for the only peace he had ever truly known. And in his death, he returned to it. Years passed, and the kingdom Lady Gan had helped build continued, though not without strain. Liu Bei was gone. His final breath had echoed through the quiet halls of Beidasheng, and his body had been entombed with the reverence owed to an emperor. In Chengdu, the imperial court mourned, but the machine of state moved on. Liu Shan, their son, now ruled Shu, not as a conqueror, but as an inheritor of a dream that no longer fit the world in which it lived. The passing of one ruler in ancient China was often the birth of another's myth. Stories began to reshape Liu Bei into a legendary figure, a righteous warrior emperor who had defied tyranny and forged a nation. But even as his memory was sculpted into stone, the story of Lady Gan, the woman who had shaped him in ways the world never saw, began to fade from official record. Her name was not chiseled onto monuments. Her deeds were not the subject of state poetry. To many outside the palace, she became a shadow of the past, a name within genealogies, a whisper in the ancestral temple. But legacy is not always born in visibility. Sometimes it is preserved in rhythm, in the way generations remember without realizing it, in the soft habits passed from hand to hand, in the choices made by those too young to have known the origin. In the imperial palace, Lady Gan's presence endured, not through authority, but through the atmosphere she had once instilled in the lives she touched. Liu Shan ruled not with his father's fire, but with a kind of gentleness that bore the unmistakable influence of his mother. While critics, both ancient and modern, have painted him as weak, slow to act, and overly reliant on advisors, those assessments often fail to account for the context in which he ruled. Shu was a small state compared to Wei and Wu. Its resources were limited. Its survival depended on diplomacy as much as on steel. And Liu Shan, unlike his father, had never known the hardship of sleeping in battlefield tents or fleeing through snow with only the clothes on his back. He had been raised in court, surrounded by books, counsel, and above all, by a mother who taught him not to conquer, but to preserve. Lady Gan's influence shaped Liu Shan's values in ways that proved essential to Shu's relative stability during his early reign. He trusted men of talent, most notably Zhuge Liang, whom his father had designated as the true guardian of the state. And he did not seek glory through reckless expansion. He allowed governance to take precedence over war. Though this earned him ridicule in some circles, it also allowed Shu to survive longer than many had predicted. Behind closed doors, Lady Gan's memory lingered. Her personal attendants, many of whom had become the senior palace women under Liu Shan, continued to honor her on traditional feast days. They burned incense, told stories of her quiet grace, and passed along lessons she had once whispered in the garden paths of Chengdu. She was remembered not as an empress, but as a mother of a boy, of a household, of an entire generation of women who had learned that strength need not roar to be real. The new court women, the concubines and attendants brought in to serve under Liu Shan, often heard of Lady Gan secondhand, through recollections spoken in early morning hours, or through rituals whose origins were no longer clearly remembered. A cup placed a certain way, a phrase used when caring for children. Her legacy lived in these fragments, embedded in the soft tissues of tradition. Over time, however, as Shu's political fortunes waned, the memory of Lady Gan became increasingly tenuous. With Zhuge Liang's death, the stability of Shu began to unravel. Liu Shan, left without the guidance his father had so carefully arranged, grew more passive, increasingly distant from state affairs. Ministers rose and fell in power. Factions formed. The court, once a place of careful order, became a battlefield of subtle ambition. And yet, in the small, private quarters of the palace, where politics rarely reached, Lady Gan's ethos remained. The old nursemaids still told young girls how she had once tended to the emperor's robes herself, how she had chosen to sleep beside her husband during nights of freezing wind, even when other wives had chosen comfort. They told of how she never raised her voice, how she never asked for jewels or lands, and how she was the last to eat when food was scarce. These were not official histories. They were memories passed mouth to mouth, flickering through generations like candlelight in a drafty corridor. And though fragile, they endured. Even after Shu fell to the armies of Wei, when Chengdu surrendered and the imperial family was taken north in ceremonial captivity, Lady Gan's name was carried with them, not on banners, but in hearts. Liu Shan, deposed yet treated with unusual dignity, never spoke her name in public again. But those who served him said he often stared at a small lacquered box kept near his bed, and that when he was most silent, his fingers brushed the lid, as though tracing the outline of a memory. That box, according to palace rumor, held one of her combs. Whether that is true or not no longer matters. What matters is that she had become, by then, the quiet center of a story that had lost all other anchors. History remembers rulers for their deeds. It remembers empresses for their scandals or for the crowns they wore. Lady Gan was neither scandalous nor crowned. But she was something rarer. She was consistent. She was loyal when loyalty had no reward. She was dignified in poverty and humble in influence. And she was the unseen stone beneath the footpath of an empire that rose from hardship and crumbled under the weight of history's turning. To the chroniclers, she became a line in the genealogy. To the storytellers of Shu, she became an example of love that outlasted victory. But to Liu Bei, even in death, she was everything. The fire behind his resolve, the breath between his speeches, the silence that steadied his hand. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy. Not what she owned, not what she commanded, but what she preserved. A man's heart, a son's path, a nation's brief, flickering light. She had walked beside Liu Bei when he had nothing. She had raised Liu Shan in the cold shadow of war. She had stood in the background as others claimed glory. And when the thrones cracked and the banners fell, it was her memory, simple, unadorned, unshakable, that remained. Lady Gan never ruled, but without her nothing would have stood.